Hello everyone, and welcome to the deep dive in Tosca BI. Quick overview on the agenda. First, quick introduction. Then I want to set the scene and have some slides, show an overview, and then I want to show you the actual tool and how we solve a couple of problems. And then in the end, we've got some time for questions. So maybe just who am I? I'm the product manager for Tosca BI, and I've been working at Tricentis for like 7 years now in various roles. And I'll be here today and tomorrow, and I'll have another session that is happening tomorrow where we talk about stories that we have at our customer sites and kind of the most common challenges that we face and how we can address that with Tosca BI. That's tomorrow. Today is just a more hands-on session. Now, before I start, I would like to get a bit of a feeling on who's in the room. So, question by showing of hand. Who is a practitioner and would be using the tool? Anyone? Who is kind of a manager and looking at the tool, seeing whether it can be used by others? Okay, what have I missed? What are the what about the others? How many are from the BI space in the daily work? Yeah. Okay, so it's a general, like most of the people are here just to generally understand what's Tosca BI and might not be directly relevant for the day-to-day work. Okay, great. Now, before I start and answer the where is it used, who has seen the discovery session on the other side? Okay, 2 people. Good. Because I showed this slide and it's a lot of text and I didn't want people to fall asleep, so this time I'll go a bit quicker over this slide. So I want to answer the question of what is Tosca BI and where is it used? And so Tosca BI is your automation in the BI and data warehouse space. We're talking classical data warehouse BI testing. So you have your source system, data is ingested into your data warehouse, and so you test your source system, you test your data warehouse, and then you test your BI. We're also talking ETL testing, or sometimes you hear ETL testing. This looks at specifically the transformations that are happening maybe in the data warehouse. Sometimes you hear big data testing, so it's testing in Hadoop environment, or often Hadoop is associated with it. Also big data, just because it's huge volumes and classical approaches have not worked. Where else can you use Tosca BI? In data migration projects, you go from one application to another application and you migrate your data across. Database from one version to another version. So anything that has to do with data, you see a pattern. And report testing. So the actual report that analysts, and not analysts, the business analysts use to make decisions. So sometimes it's also called just report testing. Now, why this is important to you? If not directly relevant for you, maybe it's for one of your colleagues at your company. So just here a couple of items, and you can read through them, which are the common challenges. So it takes too much time. Why does it take too much time? Because maybe it's done manually. Because it's done on a reporting layer. No tools are used. Another thing that we hear often is it costs a lot. Also, again, if you do it manually, it's more. It does cost. One of the challenges is introduction of Agile. Now, also in BI environments, we have Agile coming, and you just can't do without automation tools anymore. Well, you can, but it's not nice. User also want more guidance. We've seen, like, okay, there are tools out there, but the question is, what do I test? Where do I need to focus on? It's something that we're going to look at afterwards, but it's something very important. And if the tool can assist you there, it's a bonus. What other big one? Siloed testing teams is a big one. So organization and one team has their testing practices. Another team, another department has their testing practices, and the third one has different practices, and they're not talking too much to each other. So that might be okay for that team, but for a company as a whole, it's not ideal. So you want to establish best practices. You want to have like similar approaches to testing. Another important one is what we want to offer is end-to-end testing. So testing from the source to the data warehouse and then to the BI reporting layer. So all the way. And that includes your up and downstream systems. OK. I have covered all of them. Good. So let's look at a typical environment. So we got our source layer here. Then we got our staging layer. So data from the source goes in the staging, then into a core warehouse, then into the data mart, and then the report. And what we have here is one function that it behaves very similar across those layers for the three different aspects. The aspects are the cost of fixing a defect. The later we find it, the more expensive it is, so the more effort is required to fix it, because we don't know necessarily where it has happened, or data has gone through a lot of transformation. So that's the last point, complexity. Because data goes through a lot of transformation, it's much harder to test. So complexity increases the later or the closer data gets to the BI report. And so the overall cost of testing. So what do we want to achieve? What we want to do is we want to shift testing as much as possible to the source. Of course, not all the testing can be done at the source, that's clear. But we want to test there because it's not as complex. And if it's not as complex, we can auto-create our tests. If they've gone through a lot of transformations, it's more difficult to create our tests. But if they haven't gone yet through a lot of transformations, it's easier to auto-create. That saves us time. Also, what we want to do is we want to not only concentrate on the source, but we want to be able to test every layer. So the source, the stage, the core, the mart, and the report. Why? Because if we find, for example, we find an error here in a data mart, and we only test here as an example, we don't necessarily know where the error originated. It could be here, or it could be just in this stage. So what you want to have, ideally, is you want to have tests at each layer, because then if I find an error here and on the previous layer your test has passed, I know, okay, this is where the error is. If I don't have those quality gates set up, I don't know it. And that's what I mentioned. Not everything can be tested automatically, or maybe it can, but it just doesn't make sense. So some bits just are more efficient if I test it manually. So what I want to do is test as much as possible automatically, free up time, therefore, to test the more complex scenarios manually. So exploratory testing, Tosca's exploratory testing functionality. A quick overview over general, and this is our observation, over maturity levels in the BI space, and where companies are and where we would like to get to. So initial and lowest maturity level is manual tests being done on the reporting layer. That's it. Nothing else. Next level up is you've got some sort of defined tests. It might be still on the reporting layer, or it might include another layer. Third stage, we call it defined, is we have automated tests and we have regression tests. So some tests are manual and some tests are automated. And we have a sense of, okay, these tests are okay for regression. Next level up is not only have regression, but actually understanding the test purpose and assessing those tests, classify them into how much risk do they cover. And because if I know how much risk they cover, which data is being covered or tested, I can answer the question of, okay, what is now my risk? What is my data quality? And then the next step up is just having your BI testing as part of your business process, and really have an understanding, as I showed before, an end-to-end view. So we have tests at each layer, and it is integrated into our continuous integration, continuous delivery platform. Now, the maturities at our customers, they vary greatly. There are some that don't do any testing, and it's just done manually. Most of them are around 2 and 3. That's what we've been seeing. And what we want to do, we want to help, is getting to number 5. Okay. My favorite slide, because it shows just about everything that Tosca BI does. And I quickly explain the diagram. So what we have is we have our data sources, external system, our SAPs, our CRM systems, and data from those are loaded into data warehouse where we then run the report. So this is our source layer. It's the same diagram as before, but just a bit more detail. Then it goes into the landing zone, staging zone, data ingestion, where the data is being then taken, transformed in a classical data warehouse. It's stored in different architectures. We might have a data mart there, or we might have data lakes in a Hadoop environment. And from there, it then goes into the reporting. And the reporting, you've got your tableaus, your Cognos, your Click, where user run the reports. And so the question now is, what do we test here? Okay, Pre-screening tests. What we're doing is we want to ensure that the data that is coming, we said, oh, we want to check at the source as much as possible, is in the right state, that it has not changed from previously when we created our tests. So we do metadata checks. We want to ensure that the data is in the correct format. It makes sense to load it into the next stage. That's the first. Then once it's loaded into our staging, data is being copied or transformed. And the kind of tests we run there are the so-called vital checks and field tests. They test whether my data has been moved or copied complete. So the row counts are correct. It tests whether the integrity is correct. So referential integrity, domain integrity. It tests for constraints like uniqueness constraints, nullness constraints. It compares averages, sums between a source and a target. Next type are reconciliation tests. Reconciliation is a complete comparison of a source data set against a target data set. The advantage here is every single record is being tested. The disadvantage is it takes a long time. So it's a trade-off between the field tests, vital checks, and the reconciliation. Then we have report testing. So most of you, I hope, know Tosca. And so Tosca supports web quite well. So you can test your reports through the web GUI if you want. That's not the recommended way. If you can access your data through a web service, non-UI layer, that's the recommended way because it's much more stable, it's faster. And you do tests like you check the content from what's in the report against what's in the data warehouse. You can check for are the correct people having access to the correct reports. Is it looking as expected? And then we have a fifth type, which is monitoring profiling. And here it's about creating a business perspective on your data and defining what sort of, defining queries where you expect data. For example, if I'm an insurance company, I would create, for example, claims that I expect, certain claims in regions, and I run those against my typically production data, and I'll test that the data is in a state that I expect it to. So you define, for example, I expect in the claims example, I expect 100,000 claims in America. And you run that over time, and I expect a variance of 10%. And if I suddenly have 200,000, I know, okay, what has happened? Something's wrong. It does not mean that it's a failed test, but it means, okay, it might need to be investigated. Good. So this is the big picture. Before we jump into the demo, one more slide on efficiency, testing efficiency. And that's what I mentioned before. So we have two axes. We've got the speed of execution and the level of detail. So the speed of execution is here. And what we have is our vital checks. Vital checks, they are created automatically based on constraints that are in the database. So they read the database constraints. And they're pretty fast in executing. So they're really good early indicator. But they don't test everything. Then field tests, you need to understand your data and create the field tests based on your data. Depending on the test, they take a bit longer, but they also, because they test the data, they take a bit longer. And then there is the reconciliation, which takes longest because, as we said, it does compare each and every data set and a row in the data set. Okay, for the demo, we've got the following simplified environment. We've got a source, and in the source we have a file, which is a claims file, so insurance claims, and they are loaded into the landing table. From there, it's being copied into the staging table, and then it goes into the core data warehouse. Those tables have the DWH prefix. Then we got the data mart, DM, and then it goes into a report. So if you look at them, let's think about what kind of tests we would execute here in this sample environment. So for the source, we said we do our metadata checks. We test whether they're in the expected format. So we might check whether the correct items are numeric, they're not duplicates, they're not null value ranges that we expect. Then it goes from source to stage. We test whether the data is complete. So we test for completeness as well as has the metadata changed. And then it gets interesting because from stage to core, you've got transformation. So what can you test there? We do test our vital checks. And we can also test some of the transformation, some field tests against like reference data, whether I've got whether my claims amount are as expected. The same test types then for the MART, and the report I will not cover today. So let's jump into the demo. Okay. So I just want to make it full screen. All right. Okay, my database is called Claims Warehouse, and I've got my tables here. Ah, sorry. Can you double check, please? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I opened the virtual machine, and somehow it must have. Yeah. I'm back on the original. Okay, so let's do this, and let's. All right, I'll leave it non-full screen. Okay, so this is our claims warehouse database, and here are the tables that I've described just before. And what we're doing is we go now to Tosca and create those tests, so we have a feeling of what does it mean for an actual user. Before we do that, where we start is our requirements. And I talked about test guidance and how does the user know what needs to be tested. So what Tosca has is the so-called building blocks. And what we have here is we have an overview of the different layers that could exist. So I've got my source, landing, and then in those layers I've got sub-items, and I've got in my source I would like to test my connections, I would like to test the metadata, and I also have data quality dimensions. And I've got accuracy tests for my data quality dimension, consistency, completeness, and there are just multiple aspects to those different layers. And this is a great starting point as a base structure. Don't worry, because talking about requirements, it does not mean we are in a waterfall world. It just means that's the view that we are having to structure our test, and that's how we get the overview of how much is covered at each layer. So what we do is we'll take this and copy it here. And I've got now my layers here. And I'll just delete the ones that are not relevant to me. And I said, okay, I've got a source, I've got a landing, and then I don't have a raw vault, I don't have a business vault, I've got a warehouse, a data mart, and reporting, and reports I'm not using, for example. And right now I've got my base structure. And these are all potential areas that need to be tested. Now, those areas have different weightings. So what I would do now is I would talk to my business analyst and understand, okay, so my source environment and my metadata and my connections and my data quality dimensions, how important are they? What's the risk you associate with it? And so what we can do is we can start filling out the weights. Well, we can fill out here weightings, and we can say, okay, number between 1 and 5, so it depends how you want to do it. And I say, okay, my source is quite important. And actually, I don't use the weight, I'll do it differently. I use frequency and damage class. What I'll say is how often does an error occur in my source? And I'd say, okay, not that often, between 1 and 5. What is the damage that such an error does? And I say, okay, we really want to ensure that our source is correct. So I'll give it a damage class of 3. Tosca then automatically calculates the weighting. I can now do that. So I did that on the source level. I can do that also on my core warehouse, for example. So I have, or if data mart even better, quite often I get errors there, and the damage they're doing is quite big because they then used in my reports, and therefore I have a higher damage. What that gives you is some sort of now waiting for those items, which then allows us to link to our test cases and calculate the coverage. So what I would do is I'll start creating the first test and then link those two together. So, and to do so, I want to show you this claims file that I was talking about. So here we have a CSV file on the local system, and that's being loaded into my landing zone. And what I do is I now go to tests, and I've already prepared a structure. I created a folder, pre-tests on my source. I can now go Tosca BI and say, okay, I would like to do pre-screening tests against the file. Wizard is started. I'll select this claims file. It has a row, the first row as a header, and it is semicolon delimited. And I'll say next. And now I've got here my different columns of that file, and I can create the kind of tests I would like. So my customers should not have any empty values, should be unique. For example, my claims amount is a numeric field, and my response, or let's say my gender, should be of a value range either female or male. And so now I can create the sorts of tests I would like to. And once I've done that, I'll also create an execution list, finish this wizard. What Tosca does is it creates me test cases for this. And we can look at those test cases. So here I'm now in a execution list. Execution list is a collection of test cases. And I've got these 4 tests that I've selected, created. If I jump to it, I can see that I'll do a test is numeric, and I check whether the values are numeric, and we get a result of OK, and I verify against that. And I can run this. I go back to my execution list. I say run. One thing that I didn't tell you is to do such a test against a flat file. We are loading the file into a caching database and then run a query against that caching database. So now I've got my execution results. And now I've created tests. But now I need to link my requirements with my test. And how I can do that is I'll open the requirements view again in a separate window. And I can say, all right, in my source, what I've done, my data quality aspects, OK, I've got, I checked whether it is unique, so uniqueness test. I can drag this to my requirement. I can do that for the other uniqueness. In completeness, I can, did I do any null values? No, I didn't do any null values. What about integrity? I didn't do any integrity tests. But I did check the value range, so I'll do that here. I just want to give you a rough idea. If I go back and look now at this, the test cases have been associated. What I can do is I press F6 and I'll now get calculation of my coverage. So 2 things for this. First, you've got the contribution of each level. So the source contributes 5% to my overall requirement, and the data mart contributes 93%. Also, I only have one yellow bit, means only 14% of my accuracy have been defined because I only created one test case. So this is your calculation of what is being covered at which layer. What I can additionally do is I can drag my execution list into, not the folder, but my actual execution list on top of here. And I can add an additional view, which is the execution state. Before, we just looked at the coverage and knew what was covered, but we didn't look at the execution state. Now we also know which tests have passed or failed. So this is now linking the tests to my requirements. OK. Now let's have a look at those vital checks. The next step is we said data goes from source table to staging tables. No information about constraints because it was loaded from a flat file. So what I'll do is I'll start this time a database to database vital checks test, and I want to test for completeness and metadata. Again, I get a wizard. I'll choose my claims database. In here, I said I'm interested in my landing. So in my claims landing, I say this one. And I'm then interested in, so say next, and now that was my source, and now my target, I need to connect again, and this is my staging. So here is my staging table, so it's just one. And now Tosca has not automatically mapped those two tables because they've got different names. So what I need to do, I need to load my mapping information. And I actually don't have this mapping information here. So what I can do it manually. So I can just say, okay, my claims, landing, and my staging. And in this case, I'm interested in the metadata tests and the completeness tests. Nothing else. I'll say next. I also want to create an execution list. Say finish. And again, Tosca has created me those tests. So we said we want to create tests automatically as much as possible. If I look at my tests, for example, to check completeness, what we do is we go to the source, we get the row count, we go to the target, get the row count, and compare those two. So it's nothing else than a SQL statement, select count, that has been generated for us through the wizard. Okay. Let's look at transformations. We got 20 minutes. So I'll quickly show you the transformation that is happening. So we got our staging table. This is how the staging table, so the same as our file, looks. With customer, claims amount, etc. And policy types and vehicle type. And if I look at my data warehouse and look at my fact table, this is how my fact table looks like. And it's now rather difficult to say, okay, what do I need to test? How was the mapping? It is possible that the tester did not get that information. So he was just given the task of, okay, you test. How do you approach this? So what we want to do is first we just do a account and metadata check again, and we create the same wizard as before, database to database, from my staging to my data warehouse. I load my matches, the transformations that have been happening, the mapping. I load that. This time I've got it prepared. This is just a text file that has the mapping information in it. Quickly show that to you. This is how it looks. So source table to target columns. And if we open it, we can see what the mapping from source field education goes to target, blah, blah, blah. No uniqueness, no nullness, tests. Create execution list, finish. Okay, I've got now my completeness and metadata. Another thing that I can show you is how to do referential integrity tests here. So I said our vital checks reads information from the database, assuming it's there, assuming the constraint, referential integrity constraint information, uniqueness constraint information are present. So it is a best practice, typically they are disabled, it is a best practice to have them on there but not enabled. And why? Because then a tool can read it out and can create those tests for you. You don't want to have them while you load data. So to do so, what I'll do is I'll use the same wizard again. This time I'll just test my source and my target the exact same. I test my data warehouse as a source against my data warehouse as a target. Add this, and then I have an automatic match of all those tables, as well as I've got my uniqueness, referential, and nullness tests. Done. The tests have been created. So uniqueness, for example, tests whether you've got duplicate data, if copies have been done multiple times. Referential integrity will also test whether complete records have been copied. So they are pretty good first test, like early indicator test that you can do. Okay. So just quickly show you how the test looks like. So for example, nullness. It's a SQL that has been generated again. Now I can also do field tests, and I can show you how field tests look like. So what I would like to do is I'd like to do field tests from source, or fields from the source, and compare it to the target. And this time I say field tests, database to database. And I'm using my staging as my source. And I'm using my data warehouse as my target. This is the mapping from before. And I'll say, here now are all the fields that I've got access to. So I need to understand now my data. And I need to know what's in my education column, gender column, etc. And I've got this one column, total claim amount. And what I want to do is I just want to sum that total claim amount from the staging and compare it against what's in the data warehouse. And what I'm doing is I use one of those predefined field tests. So Tosca comes with a bunch of predefined tests, but you can extend this to suit your needs. So what do we have? Now interesting here, if we look at it, we've got as a source, we've got total claim amount as a varchar field, and then the target is a float. So how do I do the sum on my varchar? There is a predefined test that I have created, and I called it sum on a text field. And I can just select this test, so it will create me a test where it compares the total claim amount from the source with the target. And I can create another test where, for example, have value ranges where I can compare whether the value range on my source is the same as on my target. So for example, for my dimensions, what I want to do is I want to check that my value ranges are the same. So I'll do that, for example, for gender and education. I'll say next, create an execution list, and press finish. These tests have been created for me, and I can also run them. And they are failing. So the progress is down here. Oops. Down here. Okay. And so what we got here is claims amount. If we look at what has failed, we buffered the claims amount from the source. and we compared it against the target. And if we look here, we can see that we expected to have 3,000, no, not 39, no, 396. And we got many more. So it seems we have a discrepancy between the two. Also, the value ranges on the education seem not to be correct. So this is the SQL that has been executed. If I run the same SQL against my claims warehouse to see what is different, I can see that on my source I'm talking about we have bachelor, college, like our education string is complete, and on the data warehouse we just have a substring. So we need to adjust our test based on this information. Okay, I want to show you two more test types. So yeah?
So for the education, it was actually comparing the values one to one?
So for the education now, what we've done is, if I'll jump to it, this is my SQL that has been executed. And what we expected is, if this SQL, if the value ranges are the same, it does not return any values. And so we say, okay, row count must be equal to 1, just a header, nothing else. And that's why it failed, because we got this back as a row count. And so it has failed. You can write your test in different ways. So this is a standard test, but you can write it differently. We'll show you one that is comparing now between source and target. Okay. Okay, I'm aware of the time. I'll skip the reference data tests and I'll show you the reconciliation tests. And I have actually, I don't want to create that from scratch because I have done that already. So I just want to show it to you. This is my test case here. And what I'm using is I'm using another test step, and I have a ODBC source where I execute this SQL statement, and I'll then compare it against the output of this SQL statement. So this is my source and target, my complete comparison between the two. And I can also define a row key. So how is what's my unique identifier for that row? And I also create a report. If I've got any differences, it will be shown in my report. If I'll execute this, and I would expect differences because what we saw is that the sum are different between source and target. And so we have 150 rows processed, and we got multiple differences, and I got a report that I can open. And so it now tells me what is the difference between the source and the target. So this again helps the user to analyze those differences. So I see on my source for these dimensions, gender, education, geography, I had this amount. And for my target, for the same dimensions, I got this amount. So I know that something is wrong in my data on those dimensions. Gives you a bit on more in-depth overview. Okay. Now, I want to show you now how this looks like when I've completed my requirements, I've created my test cases. What do I get? So let me open this in a new window. And so here I've got my entire claims warehouse where I have assigned test cases and also assigned my execution lists. And what we see now is that, okay, overall in my source, I have only 4% of my requirements of what I would like to test specified with tests. Those tests have run successfully. I'm okay in my staging. I've covered 60% and respectively 33% in my core warehouse. And so now I suddenly have that overview that I was talking about on what do I have covered in my different layers and what is the status. So this is a real good like big picture overview. Okay, let me jump back to some final slides. Perfect. Oh. Okay, what we have seen and what we're aiming to do is you get guidance on what you need to test. Testing should become part of your process. You get a much better understanding of what is your coverage, what is your risk. You should be able to do end-to-end testing. This time we just focused on the data warehouse. We didn't when we looked at the source, but we ignored the BI space, but this is also possible. We do a mix between automated and exploratory testing, as mentioned. We just looked at the automated bit. And from Tosca, you know, it integrates into all of the typical like CI tools. So the exact same thing applies for Tosca BI. And then as a last slide, why Tosca BI and not another tool? These are kind of the core differentiators. So one aspect is the risk and test coverage, that test management aspect. Being able to do end-to-end testing, having support of the different technologies with Tosca, support of the up and downstream system, as well as Tosca's general attitude to everything that is created is with minimized maintenance or with maintenance in mind, so it's easy to maintain for the user.